Chapter 8, Metamorphosis of Philosophy. Poiesis and metaphilosophy. Acquaintance with philosophy leads to circumscribing its concept. It tends to exhaust philosophy as such, and consequently to supersede it. It indicates, before and beyond this concept, that of philosophical discourse, something else, poiesis in its inexplicit connection with praxis. Mimesis appears here with a growing precision in its essential and limited function, connection and mediation between praxis and poiesis, between repetition and creation, between abstract identity and concrete differences, between discourse and speech. If mediation seeks to be totality, if it claims to dominate the terms that it links, this claim has only a certain time. The fundamental contradiction, which has moved to the fore and become fundamental for us, is between philosophy and the non-philosophical world. In itself, this is only one of the contradictions of praxis. In terms of what we are concerned with here, this contradiction is principal, essential. Praxis, according to Marx, will resolve it, by actualizing philosophy in the non-philosophical world, and not by renouncing philosophy and letting the non-philosophical world follow its course. We add here that this contradiction will be resolved by liberating the higher part of human activity from its lower part. Philosophy figured both in the higher part and in the wretched part. It thereby made a powerful contribution to the definition of man. Superseding it defines him still better. To sum up, is not what remains of philosophy, in the direction of its superseding, in fact and anthropology? Every philosopher has discovered a feature, an aspect of man, and done so as a function of his own time, his experience, his environment, in existing praxis and its problems. Then he has one-sidedly expanded this feature, driving it to absurdity. We shall not speak here of philosophical anthropology, but rather philosophy considered as anthropology, or philosophies as attempted anthropology. Nonetheless, this term immediately demands precautions and reservations. First of all, anthropology takes man as the object of its study, and studies a definition, determination, of man as object. It leads to a closure rather than opening up horizons. For the theory of praxis, man defines himself in this praxis. His determinations are multiple. None of them is exhaustive. Moreover, it is not so much a question of describing, analyzing, exposing or explaining, in short, of knowing the human, but rather of creating him. And not only of leading or educating him in the name of an already established knowledge and definition. Any definition or determination is limiting. Total man is not one thing or the other, homo faber, sapiens, ludens, ridens, and so forth. He is all this, and still something other that is not yet said because it is not yet created. Secondly, anthropology at the present time has taken a direction that is clearly structuralist and culturalist. It opposes culture and nature, defining social man by a culture. This anthropology of American origin has been transplanted into France by Claude Lévi-Strauss, even if he attenuates some of its paradoxes. Cultural anthropology emphasizes anti-nature, antithesis, and the wager against nature in the cultural. The structure of society, of its varied communications and exchanges, is at least said to be independent of nature. This is true to a certain extent and up to a certain point, beyond which this truth changes into error and the concept into philosophy. We have given the concept of structure its place, a very broad one, the better to refute extrapolations. The relative independence of nature and culture holds perhaps for archaic societies that, without having historicity in the broad sense of the term, have all the same changed by the constitution of styles of life, wisdoms. This appears to us as the mode of evolution of societies that do not evolve in the sense of accumulation, and that keep the primitive community as their base. As far as these societies are concerned, between the thesis of the world of scarcity and those of culturalist anthropology we take a more dialectical and more flexible position. On the base of the tribal or peasant community, starting from a meager social surplus product, privileged groups, which do not yet constitute classes, but can form themselves into castes, warriors, priests, lords, dignitaries, etc., produce remarkable works in domains that the process of accumulation is bound to ravage. The sumptuary expenses of these groups were justified to the community to which they still remained beholden. This age of scarcity was thus one of festivals, wisdoms, monuments, styles, style not ruling out cruelty, as there have been styles of cruelty, for example in pre-Columbian America. In these cultures and styles, a distance is established between man and nature. Man has a margin of freedom. He plays with his nature, not against it. He investigates it without losing initial and vital certainties. Cosmogonies, mythologies, symbolisms, then a nascent philosophy that responds to his questions. At this time, the human was not yet detached from nature. Capitalism, with the unlimited extension of the market and the power of money, was bound to accomplish this rupture, and only it could do so. Marx was alone in proclaiming a reconciliation between man and nature, by way of the accumulation of capital and the growth of industry, by way of the abstraction of science and concept, technology and culture. Without going any deeper, without saying in what way his notion of nature differed or did not differ from the Greek physis, without falling into the abstract lyricism of uprooting and rootedness, he explained that the split between man and nature was produced only by way of an indissoluble, dialectical unity. And this was one of the strongest reasons for his rejecting metaphysics. According to Marx, with the accomplishment of the industrial age, man's relationship with nature would turn out to be not instrumental, but one of co-substantiality and co-belonging. In sum, philosophy as such springs up with the beginnings of the process of accumulation, knowledges, techniques, goods and wealth, with its uncertainties. It reaches its apogee and its end when this process has taken shape and is approaching its term, despite hindrances. The industrialization process does not answer all questions. It suppresses many and raises new ones. Both necessary and insufficient, it renders interpretations useless and makes the transformation of the world and its own transformation indispensable. A new form of thought and action appears, a different relationship with nature. Philosophy has too often destroyed or shrunk the notion and images of physis, especially since Descartes caught on this point in a conflict between the concrete unity that he detected of body and soul, particularly in his passions of the soul, and the separation that his theory of substance demanded. With Kant, another example of this shrinkage, nature is reduced to the dust of phenomena informed by the categories, and unified in a more concrete manner only in the work of art, by a transcendental finality. Metaphysis followed the lines of Christianity, a split always further aggravated, a disdain for the sensuous and the flesh, for the world. The sense and sentiment of physis, during the domination of metaphysis, was preserved above all in underground currents and heresies, Paracletism, the doctrine of the Rosicrucians, the recall of ancient Dionysianism, Rabelais. On this side, traditional philosophy and metaphysical systems fit well enough into a structuralist and culturalist anthropology. But we know that this aspect of systems does not exhaust them. The contribution of philosophy in general, and of particular philosophies, to an anthropology does not authorize us to define man outside of nature, for example, by culture and culture alone. A determination of this kind accentuates the abstraction and extrapolation, one-sidedness, of speculative philosophies. Anthropology, the study of man as such, refers us to an elucidation of the human relationship, in praxis, in history, with nature and being. It is not therefore a question of defining man and the human, but rather of dismissing those representations that claim to define him, leaving him free to define himself in praxis. This opens the path of freedom, which is closed in any other perspective. One problem remains. If man is the highest being in the universe, or one of the highest beings, how and why is this? Chance? Essence? Success? Does man contain the secret of the world, as opening and summit? How and why? Was it not on the contrary, as Louis Bulk's theory suggests, one a weakness that gave the human being its chance, by a surprising dialectical reversal? Further research is needed. We are not afraid to recall that it was Marx himself who on this point explored the praxis he discovered in its amplitude and complexity. Marx's thought and method prescribed for us an investigation into the relationships between the human and the natural within praxis, in the most poetic, creative part of praxis, as well as in the everyday and repetitive part. Before and beyond logos, before and beyond what historically has passed into philosophical discourse or has been brought into language by philosophers, in other words, the uncertain and deep regions of need and desire, of speech and images. The philosophical project and image of man are not without contradictions, as we have noted in passing, which the supersession of philosophy overcomes after detecting them. For example, certain philosophers have defined the human in terms of need, lack, will. They have set this determination against reason and coherent discourse. Other philosophers, on the contrary, have appealed to pure reason and rejected desire along with the imaginary. Some have defined man by finitude, whether to deplore this as the mark of a tragic fate, or to assert that empirical satisfaction in limited existence can easily be determined. Others again start from unlimited desire, dissatisfaction, unease, even anxiety. To supersede philosophy also means overcoming the contradictions between philosophies, by revealing the virtual unity across contradictory particulars. It means integrating the seemingly irrational into a reason set free from its abstract one-sidedness and from confusions with the understanding, a reason returned to poetic meditation and speech. It means showing action, work, knowledge in the service of need and desire so as to change them into concrete powers. Finally, it means revealing in man a dialectical movement of satisfaction to satisfaction, while superseding both one and the other. This cannot be carried out without taking up the concept of alienation, without determining and consequently limiting it. Philosophers have used this concept more or less clearly when they sought to account for splits and gaps between the real and the true, between philosophical man and man living in praxis, between the infinite and finitude, between desire and satisfaction, etc. Philosophers by definition decided against non-philosophical man and the world, viewing these as alienated. By showing that there is also a philosophical alienation, Marx united under the same concept philosophical man and non-philosophical man. He opened the way to the superseding of philosophy. This does not mean that we have the right to abuse the concept of alienation. This abuse, by hyperbole or metaphor, perpetuates philosophy within its supersession. The concept of alienation, like that of totality, is less powerful than that of dialectical contradiction. It gives us one aspect of total history, and one aspect only. One of the most serious objections to anthropology is that, by seeking to be scientific and positive, it tends to dismiss alienation, whereas this negative, critical, non-operational concept seems to us on the contrary essential for anthropology. It tends also to set itself up as truth against history, as philosophy. Finally, it tends to accentuate what there is that is finished and dead in the praxis studied, the structure. The superseding of philosophy takes on a programmatic character, but at the same time a concrete one. It continues philosophy while radically transforming the philosophical attitude. It includes not only the analysis of praxis, the presentation of praxis in the totality, real and possible, closures and openings, levels and differences of level, but at the same time the analysis of practical energy, the quest for social forces capable of intervening. This program envisages the insertion of what it holds onto from philosophy into revolutionary praxis. It has no meaning except in these conditions, neither philosophy outside of praxis, nor philosophy of praxis. It overcomes this difference, as it also does the opposition between being and what should be, sign and sullen, between fact and value. To sum up, we can say that the program contains the following articles. A critical inventory of moments, from Plato to Hegel, discerning the propositional element, poetic speech, images, projects, utopias, formalization, logos, parables, metaphors, metonymies, in other words, rhetoric and the connotations that made possible metaphysics. It is impossible to deduce anything at all from philosophical concepts, including alienation and totality, as far as praxis is concerned. And yet these concepts can be used in the analysis and exposition of praxis. They figure accordingly in this inventory, as elements to retain. B. An explanation of the various philosophies, considered as a succession of trials, projects and propositions concerning man, and seeking to define him, thus of philosophy in general as anthropology. C. A superseding of the abstract, incomplete, contradictory character of the philosophical project of man, not only of philosophy as such, but of the man of philosophy, and consequently a superseding from the anthropological point of view. D. An exposition of philosophical alienation, vis-à-vis that of real and non-philosophical man. E. Confrontation of the philosophical project with the real, with praxis, by cross-criticism, of philosophy by praxis, and of praxis by philosophical concepts. F. A realization, or at least an opening towards realization, in praxis, of the philosophical project, revised and corrected. It is no longer a question of conceiving being, but of creating it, and first of all, meditating on the creative power released from the simulacra that this has constructed, abandoned along the way, preserved as supports. The theme of superseding obliges us to reconsider the entire history of philosophy, and thus to rewrite it in a new way. This superseding does not replace the contradiction philosophy, non-philosophy with a complete coherence, a definitive reconciliation of the rational, philosophical, and the real, non-philosophical. It introduces meditation and action into a dialectical movement within praxis, a movement impossible to escape, between the realization of the rational and meditation on the real and the possible, on creation, that is, on poiesis. Only the contestation of ever-rightness makes it possible to connect with radical critique on a new plane. A movement both double and single, impossible to understand the everyday without rejecting it, impossible to know it without seeking to transform it. Ever-rightness and its rejection put in question, fragment by fragment, the whole of the modern world, culture, state, technology, institutions, structures, established groups, analytical and operational thinking, the separations that these maintain, and so forth. This privileged contestation puts an end to the fragmentation of the ensemble. It reconstitutes it as a whole. It incriminates, though not in the same way, both capitalism as it exists and socialism as it exists, the broken totality of the existing. It brings to light correlations, analogies as well as differences. Moreover, this contestation that supersedes partial contestations is inevitable. Heteroideaness cannot be tolerated. It is insufferable, unacceptable. People conceal it, deny it, misconstrue it. No one accepts it. The critique of everyday life, and this alone, could thus combine the multiple contestations into a bundle. The new wealth can only be defined on the basis of the new poverty, that of an everyday privatized, of what makes for its wealth. We can thus detect a generalized latent malaise, and also points of crystallization for discontent and rejection, art or what is already replacing it. Questions of housing and urbanism, those of education and training, etc. We can discover direct contestations in the action of social and political forces, and also indirect ones in the clumsy attempt to rediscover playful activity, for example. Partial groups, young people, women, intellectuals, take turns in aspects of contestation, and so of course does the working class. The totality of contestations and the contestation of totality, that is, negativity, are only reconstituted on the basis of the everyday. To this general, global, contestation, linking up with the radical negation conceived by Marx, would be meaningless if there was a convergence of established systems and forms of the existing. This convergence would block the situation. It would put an end to becoming, not by the definitive promulgation of a single system, philosophical, state, ideological, moral, etc., but by the totalization of existing systems. But we have tried hard to establish non-convergence. This is what the law of uneven development means, a very general law applied here to systems of significations and operations. First point, these are multiple. They cannot be reduced to just one. Second point, we have carefully noted the phenomena of destruction, destructuration and self-destruction. Third point, forms and systems close on themselves and consolidate, dissolve or explode with a certain independence from one another, thus precisely from the fact that each of them acquires autonomy and seeks to set itself up as absolute in the real and above this real. On top of this, if there is convergence, it is rather against the systems, in the forces of dislocation and contestation, in the negativity that asserts itself against their positivity, and that contains the genuine positivity. For every system leaves a residue that escapes it, resists it, and from where an effective, practical, resistance can take off. In particular, the semantic reduction, which seeks to found a system, structuralism, turns against itself. It brings to light a residual element of primary importance, which is nothing other than time. Can human thought and action only grasp and realize discontinuous pieces, discrete units or entities that they dismantle and reassemble operationally? Maybe. But time? This is said to be the common and general basis on which forms detach themselves. It does not intervene in the formation of these forms. It has neither importance nor interest. It is ungraspable, impossible to manipulate. But then, precisely, time punctuates the succession of forms, their connections. These are born in it. The residue manifested by this detour becomes the essential, better perceived and valorized after its reduction. 5. Do these residues come from transcendences thus manifested? Do they arise from a method of interpretation, a hermeneutic that would still be philosophy? No. The essence of each attempt at reduction, or rather the fact that it has an essence, as it tends to constitute a specific system, a world, a globalization, the state, technology, etc., shows that what we have here is no transcendence. The diversity of residues and their residual character only have a meaning in and through the systems that seek to reabsorb them. The symbols themselves, as residues irreducible to pure signification, arise from physis, nature, this residue displayed by culture and culturalism, and not from a hermeneutic. Expression and symbolism form part of the semantic field, itself conceived as a part of praxis. For Marx, was not the proletariat a residual element of capitalist society, both beyond and outside it? Impossible for this society to dispense with it, despite its efforts. Derivative, thus by essence negative, and negative of its own negation, was this not how it attained for Marx the dignity of universal class? If it is not so for the moment, will it become so again? Perhaps, with new elements, in a new situation. It remains what is irreducible in this society. For the moment, we wager on the ensemble of these residues, the unease and discontent irreducible through and beneath the fragmentary satisfactions, everyday life, youth, deviance, underdevelopment, and so on. 6. A positivist sociologist would say, "You're betting on the anomic." Quite right. The theory of residues takes up in modern terms a theme of romanticism. And so we support the thesis of a new romanticism with revolutionary tendency, or rather, one fundamentally revolutionary, reprising also certain essential themes of Marxism, negativity, contestation, radical critique. An important remark, this romanticism is not based on departure and escape. It does not offer itself as a method of flight. It does not posit the essential outside of the real, without for that matter ruling out the imaginary and the utopian. Even if we grant existential thought the point that Kierkegaard legitimately protested against, the system, Hegelian, we no longer have anything in common with Kierkegaardian existentialism. It remained philosophically directed against the philosophy of Hegel. It protested without contesting. It returned to religiosity and the worst metaphysics, the theory of repetition, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob rendering what they had lost to those who had lost everything in becoming and by death, and so on. We end up proposing a method of residues, parodying the scientific method well known and little employed by scientists, the theory of which was provided by the empiricist philosopher J. S. Mill. Our method of residues contains a number of articles, detecting the residues, wagering on them, showing the precious essence in them, combining them, organizing their rebellions and totalizing these. Each residue is an irreducible to be grasped. Poiesis, today and now, starts from the residual. Its first act is to gather together the residues deposited by the systems that stubbornly persist without managing to constitute themselves as totalities, to globalize themselves. Religion, despite its efforts, has left and still does leave an irreducible, fleshly life, spontaneous vitality. Philosophy casts light on the ludic element that it does not manage to absorb, as well as the everyday, non-philosophical man that it makes manifest by expelling it. Mathematics casts light on drama. Structure and structuralism indicate several realities, time, history, the particular and specific particularities. Technology and machinery point a finger, as it were, towards what resists them, sex, desire, and more generally the deviant and unusual. Mimesis displays poiesis. The state bitterly opposes freedom and indicates it. State centralization, and even the necessary decentralization conducted by the centralized state, a curious parody, demonstrates the residual and irreducible reality of the regions. Art that has become cultural leaves a residue, creativity. Bureaucracy in vain hunts out the individual, the singular, the deviant. Organization cannot exterminate spontaneous life and desire. As forever idealness, despite itself it opens onto the totality reprised and renewed by poiesis. This latter gathers together the irreducibles. Its strategy is based on multiplicity and heterogeneity, on the non-convergence of worlds, on their gaps, dysfunctions, disharmonies. In a word, on their conflicts. Promoting a residue, showing its essence and its essential character against the power that crushes it and demonstrates it by trying to crush it, is a rebellion. Gathering the residues is a revolutionary thought, an action thought. This method of residues is not utopian, neither abstractly nor concretely. The residues in question are there, hic et nunc. No more is it perspective. What it shows is not a deceptive image of the future, despite being turned towards the future and appealing to the possible, thus to imagination. It starts from the actual, without omitting the unforeseen and unforeseeable, those residues of rational foresight that always intervene, so that the new, different from what was thought and wished for, arises from a history. It is thus act and method in act. Wagering on the residues adds nothing to them. It is nothing by itself. It is not operational. And yet it is decisive. It contains the idea that nothing is eternal, that nothing is completely durable. Not only are residues the most precious, they gnaw away and destroy from within, they explode systems that seek to absorb them. In this sense, the poiesis that takes hold of them must reveal itself as creator of objects, acts, and more generally, situations. Metaphilosophical meditation, conducted in this way, would be a method and already a style rather than a definite form. 7. First of all, it sees itself as unclassifiable in the accepted categories. Philosophers repudiate it, not without excellent reasons. Anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists consider it bad philosophy. It does not name itself. It would rather take the unnameable as its point of departure, in other words, the ensemble of residues, the disorder born of this factitious order, or more precisely of the multiplicity of factitious orders that seek to impose themselves. It arises from the pseudo-nothingness of residues that tenaciously persist between forms and systems, like seeds between building stones. Its point of departure is non-value, that which does not have or no longer has value, everyday life, uncertain speech, the disturbed situation, ambiguity. And this is not in order to create new values, caricatures of creations. It starts from the insignificant and its meaning. In the course of this theoretical and practical gathering, the residual elements have to meet up and mutually recognize one another. They must therefore transform themselves, by converging, by struggling effectively against the systems that reject them and determine them by rejecting them. It is not a question of coalescing, or adding the residues to one another. Transforming the world now means metamorphosing them. Each has to take back the dignity and strength of an essence manifested by the very fact of the attempt to destroy it, an essence that is conquered and surrenders with generosity. will this not lead to defining a higher degree of human freedom? Metaphilosophical meditation, action thought, thus renews philosophical reflection on freedom. The struggle for freedom, and freedom in history, acquire a different meaning in the sense of palpability, direction, signification, and likewise totality. The duality of moments, moments of history that the human being abandons, moments of this being that constitute it as a totality, likewise acquires its full meaning. Wagering on the residues by an inaugural poetic act, subsequently reassembling them in a praxis, directing them against the accepted systems and forms, drawing new forms from them, that is the great challenge. That is the gauntlet cast in the face of powers and the established, existing, order. It is not yet the whole of metaphilosophy. We have so far given only a first approximation. We could also say that metaphilosophy sets speech against discourse, not meaning speech prior to discourse, archaic and folkloric, speech beyond discourse and the logico-philosophical understanding. Or again, it is the rebellion of poiesis against mimesis and their bitter struggle. Or better, the conflict between style and culture. The term rebellion simply refers to the initiative and the starting point. The aim? Mastery of speech over discourse, etc., in other words, appropriation. Technology extends the sector dominated and consolidated by man like a farmland extending over marshes. Beyond the polders and swamps there is the open sea. To get to the ocean, a boat is needed. Poiesis takes to the open sea. It is also conquest, mastery of what is not yet attained. But not in the same way as technology. It attains the appropriation by man of his own nature. It is in this sense that it defines itself by the practical relationship between man and nature, between man and his being. We should not confuse poiesis, metaphilosophy, with spontaneity, though their movement is towards a retrieved spontaneity. Is there not a deceptive spontaneity, unconscious, that follows models and lets itself be conditioned? We know that spontaneity is also the act of the automaton, which moves of itself. The automaton casts light on spontaneity. It is made possible by it and motivates its critique. It renders suspect a certain spontaneity, for example, that of a femininity of which one may well ask whether it is not pilot robot of cybernetic society, modeled, mimetic, conditioned by images and objects, etc. Rediscovered spontaneity has passed through the test of tearing and split. It has revealed itself irreducible, residual, to models, behaviors, attitudes. It encompasses lucidity and action. It has perhaps a foundation or an ontological meaning. It does not react spontaneously towards this or that object, this or that stimulus, this or that image, but towards the ensemble, so as to modify and recapture it. This spontaneity higher and deeper than the elementary is reason and resultant of poiesis, residue among residues, fundamental rebellion. Not savage mind but savage desire. Metaphilosophical poiesis could also explore the unknown aspect of love, sex, pleasure. Not by the paths of sadism and masochism, though by other paths than those of the normal, of accepted customs, including conscious perversities. For love is moment, and thus modality, of presence, to self, to others, to the world. But it is perpetual creation, of presence, of joy and pleasure, or of pain, or the two combined, at the same time rift and totality always attempted and always broken. The aim today is either to deny love in the name of moral order, or, still worse, make love the foundation of the moral order. But it is precisely what is irreducible to the moral order, the residue. Metaphilosophical poiesis would thus be poetry and truth. This truth would no longer have anything in common with that of philosophy, exclusive, prefabricated, constrictive, systematic, nor yet with the moral or political order. On the contrary, it starts from the disorder inherent in the always failed order of forms. It bases itself on partial truths in order to create a truth. This metaphilosophical poiesis, therefore, does not consist in a certain way of speaking, of things, of people. Though it may also renew the way of speaking of them, of faces, homes, landscapes, and so forth. Though it may bring meaning to the insignificant, the everyday, by transforming it. It seeks to be more than poetic expression and description, to be creation. If we want to locate it better in diachrony, history, let us return to the characteristics of modernity, its conflicts and problems, in a word, to the transition and the actual situation of human being. We shall thus avoid the almost inevitable reproach of prophetism. From particular cultures, humanism and classicism, with their abstract universality, culture of peasant origin, bourgeois culture, proletarian culture, national cultures, we pass to world culture, which initially consists in the worldwide consumption and destruction of all past and dead cultures. And through this we proceed to the reconquest of style. From ancient art and art for art's sake, we proceed to a radical mutation already underway, the death of an art external to everyday life, the fusion of art and everyday life in a metamorphosis of the latter. But we also move, along the way, from life grasped and organized by institutions and ideas, the sacred, culture, to a forsaken life, from rootedness, in the native soil, the city, the milieu, to an uprooting, from man limited but concrete to the man of complete abstraction. This seems to be a necessary stage, extreme abstraction, quasi-total alienation, to the point that no one grasps it as alienation, and the theory of alienation seems outdated, lacking object or effectiveness. With the proletariat not having accomplished its task, the political and cultural revolution is paradoxically pursued within the inverted world, Marx, that of the bourgeoisie, by the devalorizing of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois way of life, by the dissolution of existing forms, by the decomposition of the individual, of consciousness, of language, without the creation of a new style. Incapable of opposing a style to the bourgeois absence of style, the socialist camp compensates for this impotence by an exasperated philosophism. Systematized philosophy, which thus falls back towards Hegelianism or below this, becomes criterion, field, terrain and stake, and due, of theoretical discussions. Obsolete philosophy and Manichean moralism have supplanted, for how long? Marx's realization of philosophy. Philosophy aggressively survives. It is aggravated in teaching and pedagogy, in scholastic and institutional continuations, in technicalized or non-technicalized culture, in philosophism. By becoming cultural, complement and compensation of technicality, philosophy becomes picturesque, an agreeable leisure occupation, like visits to museums and ancient cities, folklore. A strange mixture that is found even in the solitary grandeur of a Heidegger. Philosophy drags along with it an immense folklore, bequeathed to the industrial and technical age from earlier times. The tradition of the rural world, ideas on nature of agrarian origin, the oldest of symbolisms, are all reborn in it. Compensation and consolation is sought in the face of the aridity of the signs and significations that proliferate but do not people the robotic desert of modernity. We know that the abundance of signifiers arouses a specific pathology. Philosophy conveys pre-capitalist representations and values, agrarian or handicraft, as well as their abstract negation. In Heidegger and also Baudrillard, we find ideas and dreams about the home, the elements, the sacred. For these great meditators, and this is perhaps a trace of philosophism, the concern for comprehension wins out over the exploration of praxis. Comprehension reveals itself in profound but archaic symbolisms. This remark enables us to take a distance from both Heidegger and Baudrillard, not without making clear their prestige as thinkers of transition within the transition. 8. We may also meditate on the invasion of anthropology and ethnography into philosophical thought. A strange mixture, the meaning of nature set against technology and the cybernetization of society, but in confusion. The search for roots, a distant prefiguring, perhaps, of the alliance with nature proposed by Marx. Unless it is simply a parody mimed in more or less picturesque fashion. Here we again find our hypothesis, developed and supported. Philosophy pursues its globalization, along with the state, with technology, with art. Globalizations of real systems are pursued, not without conflicts between world powers. The alienated powers pursue their career. They will continue to the end of automatization. We do not say, the end of reification. An automatism is not a thing, in the sense included in the term reification. The robot simulates logical thought, logos, to the point of attaining and embodying this. Mimesis constitutes a thing that is also non-thing, mixed, transition and intermediary between thing and non-thing. Hence our constant reservations about the current use of the term reification. At the same time, we see in parallel the degradation of philosophy, the bureaucratic rotting of the state, the deterioration and devouring consumption of art, the robotization of technology. At the same time again, the radical critique of philosophy pursues its path, and likewise revolutionary struggle, the mutation of art into everyday life, and the effort to redeem creative, poetic, speech from cybernetized and mimetic discourse. Metaphilosophical thought encompasses this fragmentary, broken totality, en route towards something else, towards a planetary totality that is totally new. Along with the globalization of autonomized and automatized powers, at the same time the true powers of the human being, his moments, strengthen and reassert themselves, play, rest, love, poetry, and so on. Already, if we can divide it, the party of supersession of philosophy and metamorphosis of the everyday constitutes a party, despite or against philosophical and philosophical political parties. Man is total. Being and conscious, thought, or if you prefer, nature and praxis, recognize one another and encounter each other in their reciprocal shared belonging and appropriation. Not without conflicts. This totality can be attained neither by philosophy, nor by some science of human reality, nor again by the ensemble of these sciences. These sciences can be neither separated nor united. As soon as they are separated, they confront each other in a formless babel, and as soon as the attempt is made to unite them into a synthetic picture, they divorce and each goes its own way. Only a new thought, aimed at a totality that is determined neither as economic, nor as sociological, nor as historical in the usual sense of the term, and yet takes into account all these levels and elements of the real, can dominate the sciences. Only it can define, starting from the real, from facts and results, but above all from absence and absences, lack and lacks, gaps in the real, empty places or the empty place, in short, from negativity and radical critique, the future, virtual, possible totality. It is not inconceivable that, during this transition, metaphilosophical meditation may support for tactical reasons a new type of thinker, the nexialist, capable of standing at the noob of fragmentary knowledges, programming research in this direction, and contributing concrete solutions to this or that partial problem. The debate thus engaged can only deepen. We must not retreat in the face of its depth, but on the contrary, expand this. It compels us to redefine socialism and communism as perspectives, possibilities, of the historical movement. New elements have intervened since Marx and Lenin, which demand a redefinition. What are these elements? Technology, on the one hand, with the technocratic danger it involves. The state, on the other hand, and the necessity of reconsidering its enormity and its withering away, in the absence of which Marxism-Leninism collapses, leaving only a technique of rational planning and accumulation. Marx's thought on socialism is confronted with the historical experience of a century. Illuminated in this way, it can be summed up in a few formulations. A process of accumulation constituted in Western Europe imposes a new situation on the world. Accumulation encompasses the two essential forms of wealth, the means of production and the goods produced. It includes on the one hand the accumulation of technologies and knowledges, on the other hand the accumulation of material objects that ensure the application of knowledges in praxis. The process of accumulation thus has form and content. It contributes certainties that abolish philosophy as vague and uncertain, thus abstract, research for truth in general. But it raises new questions. First of all, it has to be assured as growth by eliminating external obstacles and internal barriers. Secondly, it has to guarantee that the cumulative process will be in the service of the human being, social and individual. Growth and development must go together. The first aspect is necessary but not sufficient. The second aspect is indispensable but hard to realize. The appropriation of nature has two aspects: mastery of the external, material, world, and appropriation by man of his own nature, biological, physiological, social, psychological. This second aspect, appropriation, presupposes the first, but on this material basis a dialectical movement is not devoid of conflict. It would be impossible to warn too much against the automatization of the accumulation process. Since the death of Marx, in fact, the great novelty, as a consequence of the world historical situation, failures of the revolution, division of the world into two camps, technological race, with its economic and social base in arms rivalry and the arms race, the great innovation introduced by history is this autonomization of the process. On the other hand, experience shows that state capitalism and state socialism, despite their internal differences and specific tendencies, sometimes come dangerously close. The definition of socialism in terms of the absence of private property and the means of production, in terms of collective property, is insufficient. We need to spell out the modalities of the possession and social management of the means of production, self-management, autogestion, in particular. Lenin was completely in the line of Marxist thought and project when he defined socialism in 1917, after the October Revolution. This definition was simple, no doubt a bit too simple, because it left aside fundamental theory and practical difficulties. Yet it was inserted immediately into praxis, and contained the essential, Soviets plus electrification, in other words, economic, technological, growth plus democratic organisms capable of controlling it and verifying its orientation. Today, must we not redefine socialism as a function of these two aspects and their new demands, technology, democracy? Definitions in terms of the state, workers' state, people's state, in terms of economic growth alone, in terms of the power of the party, have had their day. Would not socialism, in our days, be a dense network of organisms at the base, in production units and territorial units, plus an ultra-modern equipment and electronic machines? The base organisms would ensure the direct expression of social needs, and more generally control over the summit, without which there is no democracy. The democratic character of planning would be guaranteed by this control, and economic growth subordinated to social needs expressed, rather than detected by specialists, or formulated by experts. The end of private property and the means of production would thus involve their social management. This management, bound up with the above double network in production and territorial units, would simultaneously ensure, according to the fundamental Marxist project, the disappearance of the bourgeoisie as ruling class and the withering away of the state. Without a complex network, what would be the result of electronics, cybernetics and information theory applied to economic management? They would attribute exorbitant power to technocrats, manipulators of man and information. They would maintain the state with its prerogatives, aggravated by this power, even if politicians keep a certain part, and possibly come into conflict with technocrats. Today machines make possible the administration of things without resource to the active participation of men. Without machines and the electronic gathering of information, democracy at the base risks collapse into the inorganic, the promotion of incompetence. The two elements therefore form a whole. One is impossible without the other. Control of accumulation is certain, and the coherent, rational, shaping of praxis assured. A fundamental problem is resolved, taking technology away from technocrats. This schema omits, for convenience of presentation, the inevitable contradictions between its elements. It makes sense only for the highly industrialized countries, which corresponds to a demand of the situation. The tendency to think socialism as a function of countries that are little or poorly developed, and their particular social and political needs, notably as far as the state is concerned, has become preponderant. The Hegelian and Lassallean theory of state socialism, rather than the Marxist, has covered up the Marxist theory of the withering away of the state. We propose therefore a theoretical model that makes it possible to appreciate the distance that separates this or that country, in the general uneven development, from the possibilities and reality of modern socialism. In the same orientation, we may mention the possibility of a political party, a site where the contradictions of praxis would be openly expressed, where options would confront one another, which would no longer be a place where contradictions are expressed and weighed only behind closed doors. This notion of the political party goes further than the customary democratic demands, free expression of tendencies, currents of opinion, etc. Is it not the Marxist and Leninist conception of the party? Who could refuse it? Many people. Those who place tactics and organization above theoretical thought. Those who pin labels on ideas and people, revisionist, dogmatic. Those who have not had this conception, despite its necessity, because they think differently, according to empirical schemas, or simply obsolete schemas in their fixed dogmatism. What we propose with this schema is simply a project, a model. Its possibility is a certainty, but not its realization. We cannot roll out the hypothesis of a colossal miscarriage of human history on the planetary scale. We must even, at certain moments, bring examination of this hypothesis to the fore, to assess its chances and risks. As the most dangerous and extreme hypothesis, we have to take account of it so as better to combat it. neither planetary miscarriage nor nuclear annihilation can be ruled out as impossible. The miscarriage, for example, the definitive consolidation of the state, would arrive at the historical moment of success, with all the means of succeeding. The most probable, however, is a mixed period in which partial miscarriages and partial successes, failures and favorable tendencies, will be mingled. If we now place ourselves at the level of individuals and their immediate, interpersonal, relationships, what have we gained? A conviction. We have to dissipate the myths of everyday life by a radical critique. They cede nothing, in terms of influence and toxicity, to the great ideological and political myths. Myths of apprenticeship and entry into life, of maturity and adult age, of the father, since the establishment of the everyday, these images are no longer anything but survivals. Today they mask the reality of which they form part. They accentuate alienation and alienated reality by dissimulating it. Alienation? This theory needs a sharper focus. Why? Because philosophy of traditional inspiration, what goes by the name of philosophy, has been unable to assimilate it. The concept retains its meaning only by freeing itself from systems. On the other hand, literature has seized hold of it. Alienation, become a literary commonplace, has lost its critical import and trenchancy. At the same time, alienation has been transformed. In certain respects, it has worsened to the point of making protest, spontaneous consciousness and resistance, disappear. There are new forms of alienation. More precisely, the new alienation is an alienation of form and through form, by models, by simulacra and simulation, by mimesis and the imitation of patterns, and so forth. If self-consciousness becomes alienating, this leads to a loss of consciousness of alienation, since what should desalienate itself by reflecting, instead sinks further into alienation. Some people go so far as to think that the alienation through which man emerges from nature becomes second nature for him. With duplication and reduplication, discourse on discourse, novels about novelists and novels about novels, world of image and mimesis, of copy and reproduction without limit, etc., we have now long since entered into second-degree alienation, alienation on alienation, whose limit is abolished. 10 generalized mimesis is superimposed on commodity and money without abolishing them. Alienation does not simply condition individuals. It does not weigh solely on classes. It involves the most diverse groups in society as a whole. If ideological alienation has partially, very partially, dissipated, technological alienation has readily replaced it. We can extend to the theory of alienation the concept and law of uneven development. Yet alienation tends towards a kind of totality, never attained, since this would presuppose the convergence of all causes and reasons of alienated states. But total alienation is approaching through the disappearance of the consciousness of alienation. Alienation has thus never been so real, nor the theory of alienation so important. And yet this theory has never been so ineffective, with the result that we have, as it were, to change the position and disposition of our batteries. We gain consciousness of the limits of the theory. This does not mean we have either to relegate it to the philosophical antiquities, or make it the center of a philosophy, or eliminate it in the name of an operational view of thought, or a so-called scientific philosophy. The theory of alienation, quasi-total yet never achieved as totality, remains the other side of the theory of total man, disalienated and realizing himself on the path of desalienation. But in this latter theory, the accent has shifted. It bears on residues, for example, and no longer on the general concept of alienation. The concept does not have an ontological meaning, which comes back to philosophy. It would rather be an anthropological concept, subordinate to that of historical becoming by illuminating the contradictions of history, showing the detours of human realization, the succession of alienations, desalienations, new alienations, which forbids us, as Marx thought, from substantifying, fetishizing, ontologizing the historical outside of the human. As philosophical concept, alienation turns against philosophy and questions it, since there is, among others, a philosophical alienation. The theory of alienation signifies that philosophy sought to say what man is and what he can become. It also signifies what philosophy did not manage to say, still less do. What did it say? What man is and also what he is not, what prevents Homo philosophicus from acceding to being, that is, to realization. Philosophy sought to be praxis inasmuch as it indicated the path of alienation, and consequently of desalienation. It did not manage to act and insert itself into praxis, inasmuch as the philosopher was himself alienated. Hence the split that situated it outside of praxis and poiesis, in order to reduce it to a particular mimesis. At the extreme, the theory of alienation indicates in what way and how mimesis realizes, illusorily, human being, and loses it by alienating it. This theory cannot dominate mimesis and designate poiesis, except from outside and afar. It is not the highest theory. As regards totality, that is, total man, we detect the double aspect of the situation where we are in the radical mutation that we are living. On the one hand, total man is close. We are that, all that, already, here and now, play, love, knowledge, labor, and so forth. Apostrophe become what you are. This motto, one of the most poetic that any man has uttered, prescribes the possible and detects it in the real. The goal seems close, and yet it is distant. What do we have of these powers and modalities of presence, to self, to the other, to the world? What does the man of today possess? Traces that are also germs, and that we have been able, with this hope, to call residues. It is a narrow and difficult path simply to supersede the fetishisms of commodity and money, discourse and communication that accompany disturbing deteriorations and destructions, or to dominate the reigning mimesis and subordinate the process of accumulation to man by appropriating it. The passage from the possible to the real, from the germ to the act, from the residual to the essential, cannot be accomplished by thought, still less by a reflexive, philosophical thought. It implies a praxis. Man will be the supreme being for man. This has either not been said by philosophers, or said badly, attached as they are to the transcendent true, beautiful and good. But human being will only be the supreme being for human being inasmuch as being, nature, life, with their multiple modes, attributes and powers, is for him the supreme goal and meaning. And consequently inasmuch as man is the supreme being for being. Something of which philosophers have sometimes had a naive and hesitant presentiment, but that only Marxism, superseding philosophy, has brought into praxis. Perhaps exploration of this being will supply some of the secrets of this world or universe whose appropriation constitutes poetic truth in praxis. Perhaps we shall be able in this way to answer, on a new level, various demands from philosophers that they have been unable to answer. There will be a kind of turning point, not, as Hegel would have said, in the concept alone, but in activity. are we then going to continue to philosophize, despite claiming to supersede philosophy? Not quite. We are going to grasp our praxis renewed by a poetic decision and say what it reveals. Is this universe our own, not essentially, if we may say so, approximate and relative? These terms do not mean the same as ambiguous, or uncertain, or ungraspable. They go hand in hand with becoming. How could universal becoming create constant entities, with absolutely defined contours, destined therefore not to escape from themselves? No concept suffices to grasp this universe and the realities that it totalizes. The most pertinent oppositions of concepts do not catch everything in their grip. Something always spills over. Nothing can be drawn without a wobble in the contours that gives the drawing life. Ruler and compass do not create. No line, no force, no volume, no circle and no real sphere are perfect and finished. Concepts and oppositions of concepts are always on the side of the determined, thus the finished, the terminated. Their negation contains their dialectical truth. Negation, however, is first of all the approximation and relativity of well-determined limits. The universe is infinite, negation of the finite. This negation starts with the inexactness of limits. Is this not why the residual, which determined concepts do not manage to reduce, has such importance? That which overflows concepts and conceptual grids seems at first, from a point of view beyond concepts, a mere residue. This residue is then manifest as what is most precious, the infinite in the finite, the inexhaustible creative power considered not ontologically or mystically, but in a concrete and historical fashion, in other words, poiesis. Dialectical thought then appears in two ways, in the double determination inherent to any apprehension, thus any concept, and in the overflowing of every concept, the principle of supersession. This universe would be approximate from the standpoint of the rigorous form of discourse. This character itself could not be considered as a metaphysical definition. It would be neither irrational nor absurd, nor in itself full of meaning. It would be characterized neither by meaning nor by the absence of meaning. Man would be neither its end nor its aim, neither its absence of end nor its absurdity. This universe would be neither world nor cosmos, neither oriented time nor hierarchically ordered space, but infinity in time and space, producing itself in finite time and space. It would be neither stability nor wandering, neither unformed not structured, but something other. Neither play, nor out of play. A universe of this kind could not be called either good or bad. It is doomed neither to success nor to failure. Neither causally determined nor determined by an end, nor undetermined. Between being and nothingness, between matter and spirit, between the in itself and the for itself, between the determined and the undetermined, these traditional concepts of philosophy, there would be the site of a plasticity without assignable limits, a domain shared up to now by three terms, praxis, mimesis, poiesis. Man and the human occupy this site. They fill it and give it a meaning, their own, by praxis and theoretical thought. This universe pertains neither to the pure categorical nor to the indefinite problematic, neither philosophical dogmatism nor philosophy reduced to a set of problems without solution. According to us, it pertains to concrete questions and questionings, at the same time particular, specified, and general. The terms that are useful to us in thinking it, mystery and transparency, meaning and non-meaning, etc., still bear an echo of their philosophical past. Man finds himself called upon to create his dwelling, not, as Heidegger says, the dwelling of being in language, but the dwelling of man as human being, constructed by praxis on earth. In this attempt, which philosophy has accomplished for its part, with its own means, its essential means, discourse, it has failed as philosophy, like religion. It is no longer a source of invention. It has been unable to emerge from metaphysics. It falls back sooner or later into theology, every philosophy's spot of infection, with the further role of portraying in itself the negative decomposition of philosophy, that is, the process of its decay, as Marx boldly and brutally wrote in the 1844 manuscripts. 11. It is only by emerging from the mode of philosophical reflection that the philosopher, having become a different man, will have his historic revenge. The approximate character of the world makes for its plasticity, opens it to action and motivates action, praxis. It is not approximate in the sense of classical philosophy and the theory of knowledge, even relativist. We do not have a universe of precise forms or beings, attained by successive approximations. We speak of a double approximation. Nothing has precise contours. Nothing is susceptible to rigorous definition, including the spherical form of the Earth, for example, this prototype of stabilities and self-regulations. Nothing is completely determined or can be completely measured. Nothing is absolutely stable. Measuring instruments, the tools of knowledge, concepts, and those of action, are in the same box. Man is in the same general situation, which reestablishes correspondence and agreement between the real and knowledge, rendering useless a theory of knowledge that strives to suppress approximation, to replace it by rigor, and which by this pretension opens up an abyss between concepts and the real. The theory of objectivity in knowing is replaced by a concept bound up with the very practice of knowing, the concept of deepened objectivity, including the double relativity of the real and of knowledge. Objectivity is always won, conquered and reconquered in this double approximation. It is always challenged. The realizing and totalizing precisions that systems aim at are all the more disturbing if they succeed, more or less well, to a certain degree, almost, but, really, in this approximate world, a world plastic because approximate. They are dangerous because they impose a form, almost finished, almost definitive, on the real, and hence constitute it by making it such as it is. By making it being. Fortunately, we know that this systematic form always leaves a residue that gnaws away at it and breaks it. Man creates in two ways, one more spontaneous, another more lucid and intellectual, analytic. This is not just a question of biological creation, having children, and social creation, works. Social man has spontaneously created, in a history that is steadily less blind, cities, peoples, nations. Subsequently and since, he has striven to consciously create groups, towns, rational plans for these groups and agglomerations. This is not a matter of a difference between the contents of creative acts that are supposedly spontaneous, and forms that are reflective. We have tried to show that history and becoming also create forms. There is no pre-established harmony between these modes of creation. One of the problems of modern man is to link up with and if possible supersede, on the basis of analytical intelligence, the spontaneous capacity of creation. This problem is manifestly apparent in questions of art and urbanism. We can no longer believe in a harmony or convergence between man's creative capacities, but rather in their conflictual dialectical movement. Philosophical idealism posited and presupposed a divergence, attributing absolute primacy either to purely spontaneous creation, mysticism, or to rationalist reflection. Philosophical materialism posited, and still does posit, the natural unity of these capacities, without further investigating them. Metaphilosophical meditation is concerned with the conflictual relationship between the two modes of creation. It holds that mimesis imitates poiesis, but also caricatures and parodies it. Mimesis, when it produces, does not reproduce poetic creation. It adds something else to it, something specific to itself: facticity, abstraction, autonomization, fetishism, pleonasm. The function of the creative capacities, therefore, cannot be easily grasped. We perceive the unity rediscovered, or one which would supersede the tearing split, in a redemption of poiesis, restored in the project after the trajectory it has pursued. Thought and reflection are a certain manner of not being. Conscious and thinking being, I, me, we, etc., is. It is in the duplication, self-consciousness, reflection, of this manner of not being, of seeking to be, to seek its being, on the basis of a being that is both actual and open, body, historical situation, practical activity. If consciousness in a sense is, in another sense it is not, or is no longer. It seeks, and seeks itself. What does it seek? It does not know in advance, and when it believes that it does know, it is mistaken. It errs, error and errantry, but on a path, that of praxis and that of knowledge. It is the negation of that which it was. Becoming conscious, something philosophers tend to overestimate on account of the philosophical attitude, is not taking hold of a reality but dissolution, loss, distancing in relation to this real that is seemingly taken hold of. Consciousness is thus finitude, consciousness of self as limitation, consciousness of what finishes and what is already finished. Consciousness is thus always critical. That is to say, always at a critical point. In a state of crisis. Once assured, rooted, securitized, it is lost. It is, and it is no longer. It is substantialized and goes astray. It repeats itself and disappears into misery. But surprises that are too frequent or too rich crush it. Consciousness, the residue of everything that has been, residue of residues, would thus be in large part reminiscence, recognition, and this right through to the hope for resurgence and novelty. It hesitates between, on the one hand, repetition, redundancy, discourse, rememorization, reflection, and, on the other, surprising adventure, discovery, poiesis sought intensely if not found. Meditation puts an end to certain useless torments of reflection. It converges with being, by rediscovering or creating it. Each human being stands between two beings, a situation that is never linear, always double, in relation to itself, to others, to the world. Each consciousness, precisely as what it is not, is a project of being, someone or something. It therefore is, essentially transition, passage, from one state to another state. In each of these states, it disappears. It is the project of rediscovering lost being or creating another being. It is thus project of totality, project of the world. Being is thus double, in the sense that it implies consciousness. And consciousness is double, in the sense that it implies being. That said, philosophers have sought to define this being, either before, or during, or after consciousness, itself represented sometimes as act, sometimes as state. Metaphilosophical meditation refuses to define it. It recognizes the double determination of the real, the particular, the limit, the determined, the finite, the infinite, the undetermined, the possible, the universal. It refuses therefore to speak being, to posit the general, since and because being is to be created. Each being invents or reproduces, according to its finite power, an infinite being. It moves between the lost being and the being attained, without either one or the other having to be determined in a general way, for they are always concrete. They are situations. There is not, therefore, a philosophical problematic of being or consciousness. The problem is always resolved in the act. It remains to investigate these acts by distinguishing active consciousness, reflexive, from conscious act, inventive and creative. The act of consciousness has a role, inventory, shaping, establishment of the most coherent discourse. The conscious act differs from this. It has two characters, that of being conscious on the basis of a determined and open being, and that of inserting itself into a praxis in order to contribute something new to it. Thus the conscious act is always transitory. It moves towards the other, the object, the act that modifies this object and appropriates it. It is this act. There are, moreover, degrees of conscious act, degrees of freedom, so that the act of consciousness, duplication, reflexivity, is everything that it can be. We have already emphasized the double determination of moments, moments of history, periods, stages, constitutive moments of human being, love, knowledge, play, etc. We discover this notion of double determination everywhere. It permits and presupposes a step forward in the dialecticizing of concepts, the grasping of the real. Dialectical thought that was external, reduced to a reflection, a Manichaeism, believed that it grasped entities and the conflictual relations between these entities. Yet no entity, no force, no being is simple. All are double. Purely reflexive determinations, taken literally, are one-sided, because simplified. As we know, linguistics has displayed these dualities, connotations and denotations, signifiers and signified, diachrony and synchrony, non-signifying units and phonemes, signifying units and morphemes, etc. These dualities do not correspond to dialectical relations. They remain formal. They are conceived as oppositions and dichotomies. However, they draw attention to the non-one-sidedness of everything that can be grasped. The forms themselves are double or dual. All the more so do form and content differ, as well as the contents themselves. This dual or double character cannot be identified with the ambiguity that results in certain cases and situations rather than being the origin of this. We express the generality of this fact by positing the principle of double determination. This will display the principle of the meditation we are trying to promote here. According to the principle of double determination, the infinite is in the finite, and the finite in the infinite. Philosophy separates them. The philosopher reflected on them separately. Was this not the essence of metaphysics? The metaphysician stood either at the heart of the infinite, not without pretension, and the finite escaped him, or he stood in the finite, and the infinite seemed to him transcendent or ungraspable. We cannot think being either as finite, it is always and everywhere, here and now, infinite, or as infinite, it is always determined, posited, situated, thus finite. This is how the legible truth presents itself. This is how the accessible unity, man, world, or praxis, nature, offers itself. Freedom can no longer be thought of as either finite or infinite. It is both, and as a consequence always between the two. It is first of all, as thought, negation of what the being was that delivered itself. In the course of this negation, the human being, as free, has his degree of freedom, of concrete negation. He chooses what he will be. There is risk, wager, quest in the choice. There is ambiguity even in a trenchant decision. In order to act, the human being constructs forms. Between forms and contents, freedom seeks its way and its means. The forms both support it and imprison it. They enclose it in its work. There is thus a perpetual gap, always reborn, between freedom and itself. Hence the malaises, discontents, misunderstandings, disagreements, disarrays, ambiguities, that attach to freedom and the trenchant decision. These situations show that freedom is not foundation. It is founded on a foundation of being from which it's separated in order to be, that is, to create, to become what the free being was and yet was not. Human freedom involves a liberation in relation to needs. It has to detach itself from them, but only by multiplying them, intensifying them. It does not involve any liberation vis-à-vis desire. On the contrary, it restores this, or rather creates it as desire. Desire supersedes the conflict between essential, natural needs and factitious needs, between determinate, and thus limited, satisfactions and the dissatisfaction that seeks to escape from these limits. It is the same as need, and not the same. It does not kill need. It starts from need, supersedes it and yet returns to the original. In and through love, for example. The nature that it rediscovers is prior to the birth of precise and localized need. Desire is infinite, infinitely vulnerable, yet it bears within it its certainty. Creation and recreation rising back to the source, the heart of the new totality, is this not Hegel's rose of the world? Hegel was mistaken in finding this flower in knowledge. Marx, in the wake of Goethe, rediscovered it in total life. Culture stands at the level of needs, satisfied or unsatisfied. Style, poiesis, stands at the level of desire. Philosophy, for its part, does not find a place to stand. When it placed freedom at the foundation, it freed this from need and desire. When it took account of needs, it imprisoned man in satisfaction. It left aside desire, uncertainty and adventure founded on the relative stability of needs, but also on the lack of satisfaction brought by needs, always partial, need for this or that. Here, at the place and moment that we are, metaphilosophical meditation proves to be the restoration of desire, which encompasses the other inaugural and constitutive acts that we have traversed. In the very name of philosophy, the philosopher no longer has any more than a philosophically recognized right, that of envisaging the realization of philosophy, that is, simultaneously its globalization and its withering away, its radical critique and its supersession. The universal that we foreshadow here, in the name of an exploration of its enigmas that starts by denying the mysterious character of its secrets, this universal would obey only one law, the law of the world. The law of the world does not stipulate what the world is or ought to be, but that there are worlds. That is to say, that the finite imitates the infinite according to its capacities, being infinity and finitude, with the result that the two determinations of praxis, mimesis and poiesis, were initially fused together before mimesis separated out, finite and the infinite, subsequently managing to dominate poiesis. infinite in the finite, with the result, finally, that each being sees itself as a world, and each finite world must go to the end of its capacity, traverse it and prove itself in praxis through to its term and its end. A finite power only disappears after deploying all its virtualities, after trying to fulfill everything, to call everything to itself. Each power has to proclaim itself and wish itself and make itself totality, religion, philosophy, economy, state, art, and finally technology. Essence consists in this deployment, and totality in this global process. Each power tends from its side and for its part towards the great pleonism through which it supersedes itself because it loses itself in its sufficiency. In the course of this deployment, and only after this excessive and illusory proclamation, the negative that this world always already bore within it gnaws at it, dismantles it, destroys it. Only an accomplished totality reveals that it is not totality. Each of the worlds, moments or powers, worlds itself or strives to do so. Accomplishment is at the same time defeat. The earth is planet, stable sphere, wondering, is the figure, more than figure, and symbol, more than symbol, of the law of the world. It bears this and shows it to us. As Marx saw, in this clarity that we seek to maintain for ourselves, investigation bears on realities and virtualities that are in themselves neither economic, nor sociological, nor psychological, nor political, nor historical in a narrow and partial sense, nor philosophical. They are that, and yet something other. That are sustained and encompassed by the creative capacity, inexhaustible presence of the infinite at the heart of the finite, of its life and its death. Metaphilosophical investigation bears on this poetic power. The law of the world, of what becomes worldly and worldwide, mundane et mondial, can be uttered differently. We no longer have to choose between the determinations and propositions that philosophy distinguished, between which the philosopher chose for the needs of his reason. In a sense, up to a certain point, all is total or becomes so, or seeks to become so. Every human fact, physical, biological, economic, sociological, etc., and every human work, philosophy, religion, mathematics, the state, art, etc. In a sense, too, nothing is total. Nothing exhausts the totality. By placing itself within a particular entity, state, philosophy, mathematics, etc., a residue is displayed, which becomes essential. Every fact, every work, presents gaps and voids in relation to the virtual totality that never offers itself except fragmentarily, in relation to the infinite that never gives itself except in the finite, the contradictory and determined contradictions. It is scarcely paradoxical to reprise here, on the planetary scale, apropos entities, systems and powers that substantialize, autonomize and automatize themselves, and apropos those that reject automatism, the illustrious words of Anaximander, with which philosophy began, whence things have their birth, thence they have their loss, according to necessity. For they give to each other justice and recompense for their injustice, according to the law of the world, loi du monde. 12. Thus philosophy ends with the words that inaugurated it. Strasbourg, August 1963 to November 1964. This book is licensed to Rowan Jennings, RMJ 2131 at columbia.edu on September 5, 2016. Postface. Marxism and Poetry. George Labica. Poetry must have practical truth as its aim. Paul Eluard. Book and its fate. Henri Lefebvre's metaphilosophy has had an unusual fate. Written in Strasbourg in 1963-4, it was published by Editions de Minute in 1965. Its appearance went almost unnoticed, and until now it has not been reprinted. Why such a silence, followed by such oblivion? Was the title to blame? Is metaphilosophy any more obscure than metaphysics or meta-language, a term quite commonplace at that time, or again metapsychology, which Freud risked at the end of the 19th century? Metaphysics, Lucien Levy-Brawl, metamathematics, or metalogic? In the English-speaking world, the term metaphilosophy has been used since 1940. In France, Lefebvre's word and his project were taken up by Costas Axelos, despite other people's preference for post-philosophy, and a journal with the title Metaphilosophy has been published in the United States since 1970. Subtending all these approaches is the notion of an after-philosophy, as meta-discourse and meta-theory. I should add that many bibliographies fail to mention this book, and no scholar did justice to it until a recent thesis by a Korean academic. One and what justice, as M. Dimyoung No devoted no less than 900 pages to La philosophie politique d'Henri Lefebvre ou la politique de la métaphilosophie, with a confident handling of the material, near exhaustive knowledge and pertinent judgment that might well confound indigenous researchers. In 1965, Henri Lefebvre had already published some 20 books, including La Somme et le Reste, and the first 2 volumes of Critique of Everyday Life. In the field of Marxist thought, and well beyond it, he held an exceptional place, not confined to that of an initiator. Le Marxisme, published in 1948, was and would remain the best-selling title in the Puff Q size collection. The reason for this lack of interest, or lack of attention, I believe must be sought elsewhere, precisely in the conjuncture of the time. In 1965, metaphilosophy found itself wedged, literally short-circuited, by the simultaneous publication of Althusser's 2 works, for Marx and the collective volumes of Reading Capital. To the historical moment, which we will not dwell on here, saw the sudden transition from a humanist Marxism, challenging, iconoclastic and utopian, to a Marxism that proclaimed its scientific character and recited certainties. This transition was a double paradox, as it replaced one figure of Marx by another. The philosopher still inscribed in his time, that would be the sense of Lefebvre's metaphilosophy, referring both to his superseded predecessor, Hegel, and to the latter's perverse successor, Heidegger, made way for the scientist sure of his epistemological breaks and master of his concepts. But perhaps these are simply 2 sides of the same coin, in a 2-way swing that history has accustomed us to, or rather thanks to which a certain history, that of Marxism, can obtain legibility, either Feuerbach or Hegel, materialism or dialectics, structures or human beings, science or philosophy, and so on. But perhaps things are not so cut and dried. Let each protagonist of the time, some are still around, reflect and question his own sedimentations. On the other hand, a change of this kind, beneath the appearance of restoring the combativeness and novelty of Marxist thought, could not afford to drape a new cloak over all these omissions. Individual, subject, desire, tragic, Lefebvre would say, which revolutionary romanticism or historicism Gramsci had, despite their weaknesses, the merit of pointing out. A similar condemnation of Stalinist dogmatism, on the part of both Lefebvre and Althusser, did not lead to the restless research of the former, with the risks of its lack of assurance, but rather to the comfortable intellectual sovereignty of the latter. What we should resolve to call a certain national spirit, more inclined, in the tradition of the 18th century, towards scientism than utopianism, is certainly contestable here. It is true that, as things turned out, the PCF's opportunist jumble sale and inadequacies, prey to its notorious backwardness, were scarcely an incitement to adventures immediately perceived as regressions to the pre-Marx, idealist, anthropological or empiricist. Vis-à-vis the Althusserian Flint, Lefebvre appeared only too friable, to the point of being effaced in favor of someone like Roger Garotti, whom the performance of the famous Central Committee meeting at Argenteuil placed in the role of an alter ego for all thusering responding to Lefebvre. 5. This false reciprocity, which passed unnoticed at the time, sealed the